started.
Yep, got it. We've been talking about this with Piers for a while. Obviously, he's well known in the industry, and he's done some really interesting stuff. So we finally have him here presenting. Let's move my mug out of the way. He's presenting today his experience on scaling up BIM on some large-scale projects. And I, for one, am really excited to see that. We've been talking about that for a while. Our usual sponsors are currently on hold, but we like to, give a shout out for the years of loyal partnership. Anyway, to Microsoft ImagineNet, AEC, CFA, and all our usual venue sponsors, which are not our venue sponsors at this stage, but we'll get back to that eventually. AA credits, I'm not sure whether we're getting these this time around. I couldn't find the email confirmation for that. So we filed for them, but I don't think we got them back. The webcast is provided by Gen X, Ilkay, who is waving at us. Thank you, Ilkay. She's been with this group since, probably longer than we all want to admit. And she recently started her own BIM consultancy. So if you need any BIM work, knowledge beyond just Revit and the Autodesk world, she's really knowledgeable on that, and you can reach out to her. We're also receiving support from Spatial Ops, ARCAD, AEC Resource, and our friends at the CSI Metro chapter are occasionally helping us out. This is us, myself, James, and Robert have by now moved on, and actually looking at this, Robert Mangarini just moved on to Regeneron, actually. Just heard that yesterday. Forgot to fill that in. I'll change that. Leonard Anderson also just went off on his own with Form D. He just redid his entire website. If somebody's interested in Form D, he's doing a lot of scanning services, creating digital twins. Snick that was presenting with me, was 2 weeks ago, was something like that, at AU, where we were collaborating with Advanced 2000. Ilkay, Ian, Bob Yoris on the line here right now, and Alfred, who helps us with the recordings and the posting of these meetings later on YouTube. Right now, our backlog is thinning out. We do have a few ideas, but nothing is really scheduled yet for next year. We've had a bit of a scheduling challenge there, but I'm not sure whether January is happening, but February, I think we're having a couple of good ones. Anyway, if you have ideas, let us know. If you have something fascinating that you want to present, a project that was a particular challenge, let us know. If you have a particular challenge that you want more knowledge about, let us know. I can be sitting in front of a camera or a glass of beer and talk to myself a lot, but this is for our membership. We're getting together here to provide a value to the BIM community, and we can only do that if we know what is of value to you guys. So feel free to reach out through Meetup, email, or put something in the chat here. With that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Piers. I'm not a big fan of reading academic accolades and bios. Piers can do that way better than I can, and people are generally bored by that anyway. So Piers, with this, take it away. Find the share button on your and folks, chat, ask for questions. put them in the chat box, and we'll read them out later. Okay, I'll stop sharing. I think on Zoom I need to stop sharing before you can share, right?
All right, let me see what's going to happen here. All right, you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Cool, and the audio is fine?
Audio is excellent, at least for me.
All right, so yeah, tonight's topic is scaling up VDC. It's been a topic I've been thinking about for a while, and that should become obvious pretty early in here as we kind of talk about scale. This is mainly focused on LaGuardia. We'll talk about it a little bit. It's also going to be a little bit of a time capsule as well, because this is kind of, LaGuardia started back in 2014. So there will be some kind of indications of places where the technology has gone since then and solutions that are now available, which I'm also really looking forward to hearing people's feedback on as well in the Q&A. So I'm your speaker. I was an architect for a while. I'm actually trained and educated as an architect. And then I went to the dark side, as they say, joined Hitachi Building Companies back in 2009. And that began my my VDC career. Since then, I went from Hitachi to Skanska, did a brief stint at WeWork, I think like a lot of people on the phone. And then today I'm at EnTech Engineering PC. Also, I've been a lecturer in architecture at the Yale School of Architecture since 2011.
Oh, it's New York.
Oops, sorry, I can hear somebody talking in the background. There we go. And I think kind of the big thing I'd want people to take away from my experience is the kind of the approach that I've had in my career is to keep sort of one foot in the construction professional world, one foot in the design and academic world, and then to really just kind of cycle through those things, use my work experience, learn from my work experience, teach what I learn from my teaching, and then just repeat it over and over again. Today's presentation is going to go through these kind of 5 steps. Introduction, which we're already halfway through right now. Then I'm going to talk a lot about kind of the big concepts of scale. And then we're going to talk about, we're going to focus in on LaGuardia. I'll give you some of the basic information so that we're all on the kind of same page with it, with that project. And then we're going to talk about scalability strategies before moving on to the Q&A. First, let me tell you a little bit about my where I'm currently at. This is EnTech Engineering PC. We're an engineering and technology company, certified women-owned business since 2000. 200 plus local staff. I'm the director of VDC and technology. We're kind of one little small chunk of that, about 30 people. The rest of the company does all those things in the bottom left of your screen. Engineering, construction management, inspections, administration. The VDC team does all the other stuff that you see on the right side of your screen. We're basically trying to be either your kind of on-demand VDC department or your kind of on-demand VDC supplement the department that you have, your VDC or BIM department that you already have. Speaking of VDC, I think maybe to me it's kind of important to sort of couch in this whole thing like my particular take on what VDC is, what the role means. I mean, in general, I think everybody on this call knows that it's this sort of a term that's a disciplinary umbrella for all the kind of technology in the AECO industry. The way I kind of look at it is that it's like product management. Product managers in the software and technology world, they sit at this kind of nexus between the people who make the technology, the customers who buy the technology, and then the sort of business itself that's thinking about what the kind of profitability is going to be about that, and what the future of the business is. And so product management kind of sits in that middle spot. I think VDC has a similar role, except our client is the project team. And once again, I'm kind of coming from a specifically construction background here. And then our business side is our stakeholders, which are our owners, our account executives, the partners at the architecture and engineering firms we work with, And we're really trying to kind of help those people, everybody kind of connect and bring that all together around technology. I think it's also important to point out that my take on VDC as well is that we're sort of hackers at heart. I mean, not that we're like, trying to break into the FBI database or anything like that, but that we're, because the industry is so fragmented and most of the technology doesn't really mesh together and everybody's using such different technology, we end up in this role where we're kind of cobbling, hacking together solutions for people. So a lot of what you'll see today is kind of not like, oh, we just went and got BIM 360 and it solved all our problems. It's more of a kind of like, we had to connect this thing with this thing, and we had to use a little code here, and we had to use a little plug in there, which I'm sure is not unfamiliar to the people on this call. Let's talk about scale and scalability. So my history with scale starts back at Tachi in 2011. I was the lead on a Alexandria Center at Kendall Square, which was this biotech campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was kind of my first experience with the idea that you had to make sort of standards that wouldn't just apply to the 250,000 square foot building you're on, but to the one down the street and the other one, and the one that might be a lab, and the one that might be an office, and the one that's actually a residential tower. And additionally, the challenges back in 2011 of how you can kind of start to bring those things together with the technology that's available at the time. For those of you who maybe, just to kind of bring people back to 2011, the architects I was working with were still debating whether it was worth upgrading Revit because they didn't like the ribbon. BIM 360 glue was not that great back then. BIM 3, you couldn't really get any data out of BIM 360 field. Like everything was just kind of very new. So we were really just sort of at the kind of fringes of what we were trying to do. I think even Revit, like you were able to bring a point cloud in like in 2011. 2013, I moved to New York, started working on the World Trade Center Path Hall and Oculus, mainly doing the coordination. That was kind of my first big experience with more of like the idea that sort of these big projects, they're not just big buildings. When a building gets big enough, it begins to become infrastructure as well. And the same thing with infrastructure. When infrastructure gets big enough, it begins to kind of grow little buildings on top of it. And so you start to deal with the fact that some of the work's in Civil 3D, and some of it's in Revit, and some of it's in CAD, and some of it's in something else. Additionally, what I kind of started to learn on the World Trade Center is also that kind of sense of the temporality of these projects. The World Trade Center was this project that lasted 5 or 6 years. Hurricane Sandy hit in the middle of it and flooded the entire site and put everything on hold for a year. When I came on, they had already been through a round of coordination, and we were coming back through to kind of clean up coordination. We were cleaning up coordination from 3 years earlier. So you kind of start to deal with that sort of idea of temporality. Also the idea that like you're coordinating something on a platform, and then 10 minutes later you're coordinating something that's in a retail shop, and then 10 minutes later you're coordinating, like the Port Authority police station or something. 2014 was LaGuardia when we started working on that. LaGuardia is really where kind of my biggest scale lessons happened. LaGuardia was such a monster of a project. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about it, so I won't go into a bunch of details about the stats of the project here, but it was such a monster project that it was the first time where I kind of had to deal with scale. Prior to this, scale was just sort of a thing kind of looming over me in the background. When we started working on LaGuardia, it became just this sort of insurmountable obstacle where you had to just keep dealing with it on a daily basis. And then the last thing I worked on when I was at Skanska was this Microsoft campus out in Redmond, Washington, which is just outside of Seattle. And I would fly out to Seattle once a month, and it had 15 buildings and 3 different primes and 5 different architects, I think. Just this kind of massive sprawling campus of a project. And I was just brought in to do the BIM execution plan. It was kind of a great moment because I had just spent all these years learning all these things on LaGuardia, and now I could kind of come in as a person to sort of help, 15 different, when you'd go into the meetings, it was 15 different entities would be in a room. We had to have this giant room, with 20 people in it, in order to kind of go through issue by issue. what we were going to figure out. So that's the history. What does it mean when we kind of talk about scale? So I think when we talk about scale, we talk about it along two lines. The first line is size. So that's the physical extent of the thing, you know, just how actually big the thing is, the temporality, which I also mentioned, the fact that big projects take a long time to design and to build. And so the decisions that you're making have to not only work now, but they have to work 5 years from now. And then multiplicity, not only is the thing big, but the thing is made out of a lot of things. There's just multiples of that thing that you have to deal with. So you don't have to do just something just once, you now have to do it 100 times, 1,000 times. The second line that we think about scale along is complexity. So interdisciplinarity, big projects have every discipline you've ever heard of and a bunch you've never heard of. I think of, when I think of the World Trade Center, I can never forget how we had 4 different electricians who were involved with the coordination. About how we had, you know, we had kinds of systems that you only have because it's an infrastructure project. You know, like when you're working on the airport, you have baggage, you have other kinds of, I mean, literally you have the baggage conveyor system, not emotional baggage, but you get that too. You know, you have to deal with all these kinds of disciplines, and every discipline is quite clearly going to use the best-in-class software for their discipline. So you end up with this multi-platform problem as well. The fact that some people prefer CAD Vep and some people prefer Tekla and some people prefer Revit. The last thing is diversity, and that is when you have 100 people that you're dealing with, or, you know, in the case of LaGuardia, we had 300 people. We're just the Skanska-Walsh joint venture. You have 300 different kinds of people. You also have people coming from different cultures. When I mean cultures, I mean work cultures. You have people all kind of, you know, with different sort of skill sets, with different know-how. And so when you're thinking of what technology solutions look like, you have to think of a technology solution that works for 300 different kinds of people, and not necessarily the 20 kinds of people that you work with on a daily basis. You're not designing for the people in your office, you're designing for the people, frankly, out of it. The last thing I'd say about kind of concepts of scale that I learned specifically on LaGuardia, well, I mean, I really kind of started to learn on World Trade Center, but definitely LaGuardia really hammered it home, is that scale just multiplies these kind of minor inconveniences on projects until they become major roadblocks. And just an example of that, you know, I think most VDC managers, BIM managers, were used to being very helpful. We're used to being kind of the grease and the, you know, that keeps the machine going. So maybe you'll rename a couple of files just to make sure that the versioning works. It's not a big deal because you're only renaming, you know, maybe 2 or 3 files a week. But when you get 300 files a week, you suddenly can't do that, or it becomes your part-time job. So you have to come up with a solution for that. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. The solution isn't going to involve just hammering on people to kind of get the nomenclature right. Because once again, if you have 100 people doing the nomenclature, 10 of them are just always going to get it wrong because they were tired that day or sick, or because they're not good at nomenclature, or because they're just lazy, or whatever you want. But you have to deal with the fact that you can't transfer the time you're going to spend renaming files into just picking up the phone and yelling at people every week. It's still the same problem. I think it's important to point out that these scale problems, to me, they're not just problems on big projects. Big projects just make the problems unavoidable. They're really problems that exist on kind of every scale of project. And so when I look at this is a 250,000 square foot lab office tower that I did with Tachi. You know, this is still pretty complex. The circles are models, by the way, on this. The people are literal individuals, and you can tell how long ago this is by the datedness of the logos for the software. But the projects are already kind of a scale problem. They get increasingly complex as the kind of thing happens. BIM is a scalability problem, all in of itself, just kind of innately. As you sort of start to build out those models, they gain more and more elements. There are more and more things you need to manage. I don't need to tell the kind of architects and engineers on this call that as that kind of sheet list begins to grow, you suddenly develop this entire problem just around managing and checking revisions and keeping track of the sheet list. And the software is getting better at doing some of that, but it doesn't do it all perfectly. These are element counts, by the way, for a 250,000 square foot lab. This is actual LaGuardia. The numbers at the left are in megabytes, so at the top that's actually 8 gigabytes. Same thing, you know, the files get bigger, and then you also have to deal with how do you move 7.5 gigs of files. This is back in 2016, so I'm sure these files have at least doubled in the size by now. The fact that Revit literally can't even use work sharing on anything above 2 gigabytes. At least that's what the Autodesk website says. But frankly, if you ever tried to use work, if you ever tried to kind of open a file even over 800 or 900 megabytes, it's not going to open. And so these big files become many smaller files. They get split up and become smaller and smaller. And once again, the kind of the scale just takes a different form. Now it becomes multiplicity as well as size. The clash detection as well, kind of like stemming that tide of as that element grows, how do you kind of keep dealing with that complexity and keep the clashes down? And then lastly, the industry is a scalability problem. So I think as we're kind of talking about some of these things, it's kind of worth pointing out that we've come a long way in some respects, but the problem still exists. This is this chart from a October McKinsey and Company analysis of software platforms, and kind of they identify these sort of constellations that they're seeing starting to form. But certainly back in 2014 when we were working on LaGuardia, we really did not have a great platform solution. Procore was still just starting to kind of really gain dominance at that time. You know, like I said, BIM 360 didn't even have Revit collaboration at that time. Project-wise was as painful as it is today. I don't know if there was much of a change there. So you're still kind of working with this, you know, this fact of like all these different platforms that don't come together, and then trying to kind of stitch them together. And kind of back to that idea of VDC, this is kind of how I've always seen the role of VDC, is that it's sort of this fragmented industry, and VDC's job is to kind of connect all the dots. So let's move into talking about LaGuardia. So I'll move through this pretty quickly. First, it's important to point out, to give a quick shout out to the LaGuardia team. These are all Skanska-Walsh folks on the screen, but it's also worth mentioning my colleagues at HOK and WSP Parsons Brinkerhoff. Probably a few of you are on the call right now, but just kind of want to give a shout out. The work that I'm showing you is the work of this team. It is not my work alone, and I'm not trying to kind of represent it that way. A little bit about LaGuardia. I feel like a lot of people already know these stats by now, but I'll move through them pretty quickly. $4 billion project is the Port Authority. Vantage is the airline, is the airport operator, so they're also kind of our client. We were working on the project back in June 2014. Work didn't officially start until 2016, but keep in mind, because of the competition, we actually were doing full design prior to the award in 2016. In fact, we were actually doing construction prior to 2016. We were just preferred bidder, I think, in 2015, if I remember. It's a design build project. It's a triple P as well, a public-private partnership. The design build entity consists of a construction joint venture, Skanska and Walsh Construction. That's Skanska Building and Civil. The design joint venture is WSP, Parsons Brinkerhoff, and HOK. They got less than 2 years to finish it, but I'll show you a picture in a minute that shows they're well on their way. And then that after that begins a lease that goes through 2050. These are the projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these individual projects, but the point is that you can kind of see a combination here of civil projects. I mean, it consisted of, you know, a highway system really, as well as underground civil. As well as a central heating and refrigeration plant. That's the chirp that's on there. And then of course the Concourse A, Concourse B, and then airside, which was all the apron work and all the civil that's underneath the apron work. It looked like this in June 16. They were already demolishing the, so this is the old LaGuardia terminal. This is what it looks like as of September. You can see that the head house, chirp, and parking garage are complete. So is Concourse B there on the right. And Concourse, the first leg, that north leg of Concourse A, is already under construction. Let's talk about some stats. Let's talk about how big this thing is. It's 5.3 million square feet of site, 2 million buildings, 7 years. Of the 14 projects, 9 were VDC projects. We've got 9 separate projects. For 9 projects, that means 9 different design teams spread out across 5 cities, including people in Canada. To give you a sense of kind of what that means to have 9 design teams, that's 300 engineers. And I'm not talking about project engineers, I'm talking about you know, your structural, mechanical, et cetera, engineers. From a BIM standpoint, and by the way, these are old numbers. I think if any of those kind of Skanska-Walsh folks, like I mentioned earlier on the call, you can kind of correct my numbers in the question and answer. But back in 2018, we had 150 plus Revit models. We had models using 5 different authoring softwares. 12,000 CAD files. It's not that hard to get to 12,000 CAD files when you're doing Civil 3D, because every Civil 3D file actually consists of 3 separate DWGs. 350 Navisworks files. It's an average of 80 files per building. And then this is kind of a crazy thing, 15,000 sheets, which I know for a fact is more sheets than this now because we've been through several bulletins since. But the interesting thing, I mean, just to kind of get back to what scale problems look like, the Port Authority default sheet nomenclature standard could not produce enough unique sheet numbers to get us to 15,000. And that's because the Port Authority doesn't build a 2 million square foot airport every day. I mean, well, now they do, because they're building them all right now. But prior to that, the average Port Authority projects were kind of smaller things like substations and renovations. So their normal nomenclature that got them to, I think, 10,000 unique numbers was fine. So we actually had to come up with an entire new drawing, a new sheet numbering nomenclature for this. Some of the kind of parameters around the project that we had back in 2014, and I know some of these have actually changed in recent projects for the Port Authority on JFK and Newark. Autodesk based, so all the deliverables are in Autodesk. BIM based. Ultimately, we're trying to get all the deliverables to be smart 3D objects, and we're trying to kind of maintain that data from all of our sources, including AutoCAD. And then no cloud. Back in 2014, the cybersecurity guidelines would not allow us to host private, privileged and confidential data on anything other than a secured server. And so what it meant was pretty much all the Autodesk 360 suite was out of the question. We could use Procore, but we had to use it in a very special kind of implementation where all the data was stored on Skanska servers. What else? It was the first question that I asked every software vendor I talked to was, how do you host the data? What happens to the metadata? And it did put limits on us. Certainly it meant that like iPad model viewing in the field would have to happen by having people actually download models to their iPad. So, all right, so moving on to kind of the body of this presentation, which is the scalability strategies. Sorry, I'm just gonna take a moment to get a drink of water. So in terms of the scalability strategies, I think you can kind of, I'm gonna go through about half a dozen or so strategies here, but they all kind of break down into really sort of 3 categories, 3 overarching strategies. The first one is automate everything you can, because in a scale, in a large project where you have, you know, like I said, the 12,000 CAD files and the 150 Revit files, try telling your project executive that you need like 3 full-time people just to move files around. It's not going to happen. And additionally, I think the idea of just hiring, the idea that you could keep somebody in a job as tedious as just simply moving files around and renaming files and things like that is just, it's not going to happen. I mean, there's not really like a future in it. You know, it's not like document control. You're really just being hired to do this very specific Revit thing that you wouldn't have to do on any other project. So you have to automate everything. Anything you can automate, you should simplify. and simplify it down to the easiest possible version of it. And then whatever you can't simplify, you need to find ways to support it. And supporting it doesn't mean that, you know, 5 people run around and just sort of like become the troubleshooter for everything, which is kind of the classic, in my experience, sort of the classic model of VDC on individual projects. Support it means you have to actually build a community that will kind of support this thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. So this first one, automate everything. We of course didn't automate everything because you can't automate everything, but we automated the boring stuff. You know, it's like Al Swigart likes to say. If you want to know more about this, kind of like my journey with Python, you can check out my LinkedIn. I wrote like a really short post that I'm pretty sure you can find on there, a short article about kind of like what went into this. But basically, because we couldn't use cloud software, we had to move all these files between several servers. And once again, too, this is kind of at a point where BIM 360, I don't think I'm not sure the BIM 360 back in 2014 could handle what we were trying to do here with the kind of files that we had. So we had all these people working off their separate servers. And then we have to basically move these all kind of between, we have to kind of move all these things back and forth. And we're really just sort of like copying, moving, but we're also sort of trying to keep the versions on things. So the nomenclature needs to be right on everything. I wrote a Python, is kind of my first big Python. I think calling it a program feels a little more important than it really was, but it was a very, you know, a very long chunk of code. And what it would do is it would check the dates on the files, overwrite the old files, keep the overwrite but version the old files with the new files, keep the most current file. It would give you it would tell you which files had the wrong nomenclature. It could even do some kind of minor nomenclature fixes, but I didn't necessarily trust it to do those nomenclature fixes. Instead, I had to just write me a report. And then we'd run it every day. We'd run it once a week with Windows Task Scheduler. And by the way, this is another problem with scale that I'm sure every architect and engineer on here knows, is that when you're dealing with, you know, 8 to 10 gigs of files, it takes a long time to load those, and it's going to kind of wreck your network during that time. So automation allowed us to kind of run this kind of server synchronization over the weekend when it wasn't going to disturb anybody. We had a bunch of problems, by the way, with Windows Task Scheduler that I can talk about at the end. Basically, every time there was a major update that restarted the machine, Windows Task Scheduler would kind of reset and would not run my automation that week. I'm sure there's way more code savvy people than me on this call who are just kind of like, that's an easy problem to fix. But for me back in 2015, it was not. We also implemented a lot of automation tools. Kind of big shout out to Val Svetkov because he found all these. RTV tools. We were using that to run. So we'd get the CAD files, and then we'd have to send things like the updated footings, for instance, or what were other CAD files we had, kind of building footprints and things like that. So we'd have to do 2D exports from that. Also 3D CAD exports that we would have to provide for coordination. So this would automatically run our 2D exports. It would give us a data takeoff, PDF drawing sets. It would kind of give us some the latest sort of like working drawing sets. Solibri, I'm a big fan of Nemechek's Solibri. They had an auto run product back then. Same thing, it would federate all the models for us. It'd federate all the models for us. We had some QA/QC jobs that we would run. And then we would also run kind of basic, well, not basic, because Solibri doesn't do basic clash detection, but it would basically kind of do our model audits for us and then give us reports so that on Monday when we go and look at it, we'd have kind of an idea of what was going on in the models. iConstruct, another great product. We would use that to do all the Navisworks Federation. We'd also use that to do some data linking. We'll talk about that later. And then there were a number of tools that were kind of, that weren't being auto-run in the background by scripts, but were tools that we kind of sought out, developed on our own, reached out to people actually to develop custom plugins for us, AutoLisps, scripts, Dynamo, some other custom plugins. I think it's worth pointing out that there's this thing called the paradox of automation. It's this idea that the more efficient a system a more efficient and automated system is, the more kind of the more critical the human involvement becomes. And so, just as for instance, when you set up this kind of automated system that's running this stuff like clockwork for you every week, if something goes wrong in it, it is catastrophic because it happens. Since it's an automated system, the automated system doesn't know if something goes wrong necessarily. So the mistake that happens on one file then gets applied to 150 files. And so you can easily find yourself kind of coming into work Monday morning and finding that all of your files were corrupted, or if you didn't get the nomenclature just right, you just deleted all of your version history or something like this. Things that take a lot of time to recover. And so we learned a lot of these lessons the hard way. Like I mentioned that thing with the Windows task scheduler in my Python script, that it would work fine for about a month, and then suddenly we would find the models weren't getting updated. And I'd find out it's because the system got restarted for like a BIOS update or something. So it is something that we had to keep in mind all the time. Simplifying. So this is what you do with all the stuff you can't automate. It's easy enough to just say make things simple. What it actually means to make things simple is you have to know who your users are in order to know what they think simple is. Understanding who your users are means understanding understanding your industry. If anybody's kind of curious about this, I have a link to an AU presentation I did back in 2017 on my LinkedIn page. But it's all about kind of the architect engineer contracts and the GCCM the CMGC contracts, and the reasons why you see certain frictions that just keep occurring over and over again in the industry. But I'm not going to dive into that now. The point of this slide is that you kind of understand contractually what people have to do, and then that'll tell you what they're not going to do. Because basically, when you're thinking about the rules you're trying to set, if you try to set rules that are anything outside of a person's contract boundaries, they might do it out of the goodness of their heart, but they won't do it 100 times, which is kind of back to that scale problem. So you really have to think carefully about what people are already doing, and then find ways to leverage that, and then also kind of like what they are contractually going to do. You have to think about what your role is in the whole thing. So I stress this a lot, this kind of idea of like downstream BIM. Contractors are downstream. We get models that are authored from other people, and then we do stuff to them. But if we want one of those people upstream to do something to their model, in many situations, contractually, they don't owe us it at all. Because if you kind of go back to this, design, bid, build, the AE doesn't really owe us anything. They probably don't even owe a model, depending on what their contract says. And so it all becomes about, how do you find ways to get the applications that you need when you don't actually control the model? We did a lot of this through careful negotiations around what the design joint ventures, what they were already planning to do, what their best practices were, and then also some of it we did around by providing automated tools. I'll talk more about that in a minute. When it kind of came time to doing the BIM execution plan, if I go back to that Alexandria real estate project that I did with Tachi, that had a 146-page BIM execution plan. It featured 30 to 40 pages of like these beautiful flow charts. We did that because the Penn State guideline at the time, BIM execution plan guideline, said that you should make flow charts for all the kind of BIM applications. This isn't a knock against Penn State, by the way. I do think it works for them. But what we were finding on the Tachi project is no one was looking at my flow charts. Also, just the sheer fact of giving somebody a 146-page document meant they were actually less likely to read past the first 20 pages, which years later in my career, especially on LaGuardia, kind of lead me to this conclusion that sort of BIM plans as a document, as an artifact, are kind of useless, but the planning is indispensable. It's the planning where you get people on board with what you're trying to do. And it's the planning where you really kind of figure the thing out. So for me, it's always about kind of dialogue over documents. The document is just meant to archive the decisions. It does nothing more than that. If you say, okay, we finished BIM execution plan and we no longer need to have this standing bi-weekly meeting, then your plan is not going to work, because that plan relies on people picking it up, and also people 3 years later picking it up and really paying attention to it. By keeping this dialogue going with your design team, you're keeping that kind of culture alive. You're building that support system. You're talking about problems as they happen. You're not just sort of assuming that they looked at page 56 of your BIM plan and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. I'm a big fan of meeting minutes. I wouldn't be a contractor if I wasn't. Have a dialogue, document the decisions you make, I think is my big thing there. Do a BIM execution plan. I mean, I'm not telling people not to do BIM execution plans. On LaGuardia, it was a deliverable anyway. And it was great for kind of clarifying what our scope and contractual constraints were with the client. But I got a lot more out of our BIM planning meetings than I got out of the document itself. When you're thinking about simplification, it's good to think about this kind of concept of the principle of least effort. This is a concept that exists in a lot of kind of branches of science and technology. It's basically the idea that animals, people, and even well-designed machines will naturally choose the path of least resistance or effort. So in terms of kind of a scalability principle, what it means is that you might be able to, if you have 100 people doing something, 60 of them are going to do the easiest thing. So you might as well try to figure out what that easiest thing is, instead of sort of fighting against the tide. I am not promoting that you become the path of kind of least resistance, because I think it's Thoreau who says the path of least resistance leads to crooked paths and crooked men, something like that. But my point is that kind of like you want to kind of make sure that you're designing solutions that are the simplest solution, so that that's the one that people just naturally go for, and that do not require a lot of direction, do not require a lot of anything else. But you're also trying to not make sure that you're sort of giving people a crutch, so that they just keep coming back to you. Anybody here who's a VDC BIM person, VDC BIM manager, knows what it is like to have people come to you with a question that they could have easily Googled on their own. So once again, do not become the path of least resistance. What it means to kind of find that principle of least effort. Find those leverage points. Find leverage points with people instead of making rules. Every rule you make is a resource drain. When you put standards in your BIM execution plan, you have to think about, okay, I've got 50 people following this plan. Who's going to check to make sure they're following this standard? Who's going to follow up with them to push them to follow the standard? Who's going to do that week after week after week? Who's going to do that when through natural attrition, 3 years from now, you're dealing with somebody else? So the point is to make the rules tailor fit to your actual kind of users. So for me, working with the design team, but also with my partners and my contracting partners and my trade contracting partners, it meant that I'm really kind of just trying to ask them what their best practices are. So I'm documenting their best practices and I'm finding the leverage points. Like, oh, you actually finalize the count of steel pieces at this point in DD. That's fantastic. Now I can let my my estimators know that that is the time to actually do a steel takeoff. I'm going to do that rather than saying like, you guys have to do steel takeoff at this phase. If I do that, it's not what they naturally do. Even in a design build, there's going to be resistance. You're really up against what an organization has already spent time and money figuring out how to do. Also, any criteria, any kind of rules that you do, they should be performative. They should not be prescriptive. I don't care how somebody puts data into their model. I don't care what plugins they use. What I care is that I get a model that has the data I asked for. Additionally, keeping it simple from a BIM execution planning standpoint means you focus on the essentials. To me, these are the basic things. Anything beyond this, I don't care as much about. I can let it slip and things will still be fine. And also on here, there's things that I'm kind of like, I don't care about type nomenclature. I don't care what you call your types because I can figure out any Revit type based on its parameters. I don't need people to have a special naming convention for for like every sort of like a wide flange beam. I do care a little bit about family nomenclature, but even then I kind of don't care quite as much. Coordinate system, so much of, we're going to talk about this in a little bit as I go into kind of like what it means to kind of link everything together, but the coordinate system is, I can't stress enough, it is critical. If the implementation is easy to explain, it might be a good idea. This is kind of from the Zen of Python. So this comes back to that, how do you kind of find these interesting solutions for these simple solutions for people? Use the software that people are comfortable with. I think there's a tendency in BIM and VDC for people to try to make everything 3D and try to put everything in Navisworks or Revit. My contracting partners, they like Bluebeam, so put it in Bluebeam. So the image up here on the left was us taking a 3D image from the model and then building out a Bluebeam toolbox so that people could do their, so that people could kind of just move those things, those objects around on the screen. It's a lot easier to use than kind of trying to just meet with somebody to make a 4D model out of that. The one down here on the right is instead of trying to kind of highlight stuff in the Navisworks for civil 3D statuses, we just showed them how to highlight things in Bluebeam and then showed them how to put that in a Bluebeam studio session. And suddenly our entire studio, our entire civil team is now all working on the same document, has this amazing tracking software that is portable, that they can look at on their phones and their tablets. They can update anywhere, that has a log, action log on it. So don't be afraid to bring the solutions to the people. As much as possible, try to make solutions that are click and open. Things where people don't have to kind of know anything to really do it. Bluebeam is, even Bluebeam, if you don't know anything about Bluebeam, you still know that if you double click on a PDF, you can kind of figure out how to scroll through that PDF. That is better than putting that solution in Navisworks or CAD or anywhere else. We actually did a lot of work with our civil team where we just simply would give them overlays of civil 3D files from civil 3D that we put in Bluebeam. And then once again, if you can automate it, no big deal. It's not really kind of any skin off your back to do that for them. Instead of trying to teach everybody Navisworks, just publish a video. Put the video on your project site, and then just make it something people can click on. It's a lot easier for people to click, rewind, and fast forward on a video than it is for them to kind of figure out how to navigate Navisworks. We did scan everything, by the way. I think it's one of the smartest things we did in terms of doing LiDAR point clouds. The team scanned at every major installation milestone, and it saved us dozens of times. At the same time, I kind of don't expect everybody to understand how to use Autodesk Recap. 360 cameras are cheap. We could honestly at like 100 to 150 bucks, you could just give them to project teams and then show them how to set it up instruction site. And they could go around and use it. It became an incredibly powerful documentation tool for us. Really kind of a nice gap filler, because you're not scanning every day. You're scanning kind of like every month or so. But you can actually do 360 photos every day, every week. So that became very useful. For your partners that are modeling, make solutions. Don't give them kind of directions on how to do something, because once again, I mean, that's just a pain. Instead, give them solutions. Package solutions that they can, package the solution as something that they can run in Dynamo, packages a plugin. Robert Otani's probably thinking of the amazing Dynamo packaging tool that TT Core has developed. I forgot what it's called, but I mean, definitely worth kind of throwing into the chat. We did not have that back in 2015, so we just made these kind of Dynamo scripts that we would give for our design partners to run on their files. We developed custom plugins, scripts, auto LISP routines. I'm trying to kind of keep this moving, so I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but basically things that kind of chop stuff up for the 4D model. We had to do a full site 4D model every month. I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about this one. I think I need to skip over this, but kind of this was well, I'll talk about it very quickly. If the implementation is hard to explain, it is a bad idea. We tried to do this sort of Case Inc. developed this incredible kind of workflow and plugin for Jira. And we were able to, long story short, we got this plugin and we were going to finish developing it. Case had disbanded at that point and we couldn't get anybody to kind of finish the development for us. We spent a ton of hours on this. We hired developers to actually help us finish it. And the thing just did not work. And it frankly is because you couldn't implement it. It was too complicated. We had to find developers for Jira that could also do a Revit. They could also do the Revit plugin and the Scalability, or I should say the BCF publisher and the Navisworks plugin. Having those plugins meant we had to install and maintain our own piece of software for 50 plus people. It also meant that every trade coordinator had to learn Kanban because this was this Kanban workflow. The basis of this, by the way, was the idea that kind of, deep coordination is just like debugging. There is a case presentation on this somewhere out there. But at the end of the day, trying to teach 50 plus people Kanban was just not going to happen. So the thing kind of ended up just really dying on the vine. Link everything, put everything together. The biggest problem we have at LaGuardia, the biggest problem you have on a big scale project is the this kind of big picture problem. So this is honestly was kind of like VDC's mascot on the project. What's being depicted here are 4 blind people. I read somewhere that this is actually based on a Sufi parable, even though it looks like like a Ziggy cartoon. But the idea being that these kind of 4 people who can only kind of observe the thing that is directly in front of them think that the entire thing is that. So one person thinks that if when asked to describe an elephant, that is only the trunk, or that it's only the tail or something like that. You look at the 5 projects, the 5 major projects on LaGuardia. The head house is 800,000 square feet. If you ask that team what LaGuardia is, they're going to say it's the head house. It is 800,000 square feet. It is hard enough for me to figure out how to build 800,000 square feet in this amount of time, let alone figure out what's happening at Concourse A or Concourse B or the chirp, even if they are literally feeding building systems right into my building. So the trick on a scale project, when the models are so large and when there's so much geometry and everything else, is just how do you kind of keep putting all this stuff together? We had a master CAD file for all the kind of civil 3D work. Once again, it was its own kind of effort trying to maintain this. Once again, it had 12,000, there were 12,000 DWGs linked into the master CAD file. And so you're trying, well, I shouldn't say that, it was actually 10,000 because it didn't include all the roadways. But this is the kind of what needs to happen for people to even understand, like, oh, did I hear something? So, but this was kind of what we needed to do. Putting the models together, we had better luck putting things together in Scalability in some cases through the IFCs. That's what you're seeing here. But we also kind of put things together in Navisworks. Once again, what's automated is not that big of a deal. Though another rule of the Zen of Python is have one and only one way of doing things. We mainly kind of steered people towards Navisworks. We kept Scalability for the more technical folks in-house. This was our 4D model, which kind of combined all of that stuff that I just mentioned. When we'd package this each week, it would be 800 megabytes, which was a real strain for Navisworks back then. Probably still is. I think actually, I take that back. It was over a gig in the end. And even the Port Authority who would run this and combine it with like the Delta Terminal model would have to run on kind of a specialized machine. I'm just going to kind of click past this one. Having all those models in one place, being able to combine them with the laser scans as well, just became critical. We just really, what it ended up meaning is we had just a million ways to kind of slice the site, and then we could break these out anytime we needed them. We really tried to have models easy to access for people. We posted links on the homepage of our project that people could access easily. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you actually build a culture in which people can actually leverage the model in a minute. We made sure that there were people who could operate the model in every meeting, not just VDC folks, but also other people who were embedded with the project teams. This is our master schedule session. It's worth pointing out the reason why everybody's not looking at the screen behind them is because there's another screen on the other wall that they're actually looking at that shows the same thing. There's actually 3 screens in this room. But this became a way on big projects. So often the conversations you're having are, you're trying to basically place charades. You're trying to, like, well, not place charades, but you're trying to describe these geometric conditions that are incredibly complex, incredibly large, and you're all trying to picture it in your head. And there's nothing better than just simply having that on the screen. But once again, kind of doing that required all that automation on the back end. It also required having the coordinates just being locked in just absolutely from day one. It meant we had to have 2 or 3 different checks, quality checks, to make sure that the survey points lined up. And then we had to make sure that everybody who came on the project, like as trade contractors came on, that they also went through this check process. Because this whole thing falls apart the moment you put 100 miles together, and the 101st model is, 200 miles this way. So survey control points in every model. And when I say survey control points, I don't mean the standard control point and base point that comes with Revit, but actual survey control point objects that we could use to verify across in not just Revit, but also in Navisworks, Civil 3D, and CAD/MEP. Control points drawings in every model. So we had each designer produce a drawing in their set that actually showed the control points and showed them, I don't remember how many decimal points we ended up going to, but it was whatever was for survey control. And by the way, because we did all that work up front and because we maintained that work the whole way through, it meant that we were able to use our model as a surveying tool for validating survey the entire way through the project, which would have been impossible otherwise. The other thing about linking everything is for the data, you have to think about unique keys. A unique key is a parameter or a set of parameters that are static and do not change for an object, or for frankly a not just a geometric object, but a data object. And so if you have 2 of those things, you can link them together. So for instance, things like piece mark, equipment number, these are unique keys. Global user IDs are not unique keys. They get overwritten all the time, so you can't really use those. They need to actually be a thing that isn't generated by the software, that actually lives independently, the people QA/QC. Additionally, what that gets linked to should be something that people really do QA/QC. So these are things like orders lists, commissioning checklists, fabrication logs. These are records of data that each entity actually keeps and that they own. Your commissioning agent, their checklist is accurate because that is part of their job, not because you ask them to keep an accurate checklist. The fabrication log is accurate because the fabricator just does it, not because you wrote a thing on page 50 of your BIM execution plan that all fabricators should keep a fabrication log. So once again, this still kind of ties back into that, keeping it simple as well. Some examples of the data linking. We linked in steel information from the fabricators. We were able to do this through SmartBIM, also through iConstruct's data linking tool. I think we also wrote some data in using Revit, but I don't remember that. We tried to do everything kind of on the back end. Also able to get kind of heavy crane picks from the fabricator, which we were then, our steel team was able to use this to kind of plan the erection sequence, knowing where the heavier crane picks are, which take longer. We did the same thing for prefabrication on the concrete members for the parking garage. Once again, linking piece mark, the piece mark that's on the fabrication checklist to the piece mark that is in the concrete model itself. And once again, I trust those things because I know that the people who do them, it is their job to do them, and not because I'm asking to do it. We also had a mobile thing that we used, that we did with it, was a combination of BIM 360 and SharePoint. That basically just allowed people to be able to look up models by piece mark, and then they could also look at the status of these in SharePoint tables. By the way, this would be 10 times easier to do today because of Microsoft Power Apps. I wouldn't do this the way we did it now.
Hey, Dennis.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, everybody says Andre Boss, so I keep thinking Andre's stopping me because I'm because I'm going long. So this is the last section. I'm wrapping up now. Whatever cannot be simplified, support. And what it means to support, it means is you have to build kind of support structures. We kept thinking about this concept in the project. IDEO talks about okay. I'll just repeat that because I'm not sure where I got muted. So IDEO talks about, the design firm talks about this idea of T-shaped people. And the idea being that they have this kind of broad base of knowledge and skills, but then they have a lot of specific depth in one or two areas of expertise. And IDEO's whole thing was that that's the kind of people they try to hire. Additionally, kind of within VDC, that was also how we were trying to build out our team. So we had this idea of kind of like, well, there's this baseline we want. We'd like everybody to know enough Navisworks that they can kind of like double click a file and just spin the model. We don't expect them to know how to do anything more than that, but they should be able to do that one thing. We expect everybody to know Bluebeam. We expect everybody to at least know what VDC does and who we are. And that was kind of this 101 orientation we would do for people as they came on board. And then we had people called champions who would run our coordination, who maybe didn't do 4D, but they understood what it was and they understood how to leverage Navisworks at a higher level. They knew how to get files out of, they knew how to print sheets out of Revit. They knew how to print sheets out of CAD. In order to kind of make these T-shaped teams, we had to think a lot about what our training program was. The training became really critical on LaGuardia. We were kind of thinking about how we can build networks. So, you know, on this diagram on the right, essentially it's like the you know, the nodes are kind of like your VDC people, and then we're attaching to those sort of these people that we're training, who are like our VDC champions, VDC interns. VDC at all times had 2 or 3 interns or co-ops who then kind of would be with us for anywhere from 1 to 3 months, and then would go somewhere else on LaGuardia. We trained. I wrote in here Navisworks and Bluebeam training for all. We only trained about maybe 50 people in Navisworks, because I don't think everybody needs Navisworks training beyond being able to spin a model. And then Bluebeam training, we trained, I think 175 people in the end. And we just kind of kept doing it. We like doing it in person. We did video recordings too, to try to reach as many people as possible. But the in-person was just a much better kind of way to kind of make that information stick. Our champions, the kind of model for our champions, you know, are like Medwin here, who was who's also on our VDC team for a little while. But the idea being that we're trying to kind of create, like, to my mind, operations as a person who knows Bluebeam so well, they can navigate a PDF in a smart way using all those kind of modern day computational PDF tools. And then at the same time, they can look at that drawing. If they have questions, they can look at the model and navigate that. And they can use the model to ask questions of the drawings and the drawings to ask questions of the models. That was really the kinds of people we were trying to create. We did a VDC Champions program. We tried to make it fun. We had prizes. We did kind of a scavenger hunts within the model where people try to find things. If you look on the right in the background, you see Yoda. They always end up having Star Trek themes. I think that was, or Star Wars themes. I think that was, I believe that was Val's Val's idea. And at the end, we'd have kind of people hold this sort of like, you know, the champion of the champions belt kind of a thing. And they'd win like a Starbucks gift card. But once again, like trying to make it fun, trying to kind of build this culture. And then one of the last things we did within VDC is we built out our own kind of knowledge database. We used Atlassian Confluence. So if it kind of seems like I was throwing Atlassian Jira under the bus in an earlier slide, I'm gonna now hoist up Atlassian Confluence. It was basically like a wiki for us. And then this became the place where people documented best practices. When we would have new interns and new hires come in, we would kind of send them here to be a place where they could kind of scan. I originally wanted this to be Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow, I think it's called Enterprise. But then when I went to talk to the Stack Overflow folks, they said if I had anything less than 500 people using it, it wasn't going to work. So we ended up using Confluence instead. But we built out the kind of wiki. People would go in, if they saw issues in it, they could edit it. We were also kind of putting in research that people were doing here. We kept our meeting minutes in here. So it really just became this kind of fantastic base of knowledge for us. And I still think knowledge management is a huge gap that the industry just frankly doesn't, I haven't seen too many that kind of handle it that well. And I think that the last thing I kind of want to say on that is just, back on kind of Stack Overflow, Mark Birch from Stack Overflow had this great quote: "The leaders of the future will be community builders first." And I think that's probably my biggest lesson for these large scale projects is that you can't expect to manage 100 people. You can't even expect to direct managers that will manage 100 people and kind of achieve the full success. You really need to build this community. You really need to kind of get people around the idea of what you're doing, get them excited about the innovation and the technology that you're using, give them the tools that they're using. People who don't get the tools that they need, make sure that they feel like they're cared for, that they're not being left behind. One quick example of that is originally the way we used to give out iPads on LaGuardia is we give them out the same way we give phones. You just get an iPad. And what was happening with a lot of our kind of less tech savvy people, particularly people who spend a lot of time in the field, is they get this iPad. If any of you have tried to open up an iPad in the last 10 years, you go through like 8 screens of questions like, do you want this to scan your iris? Do you want to share all your data? Do you want to set up Apple Wallet? Can we have your fingerprints? Like it's a bunch of crazy big questions. And a lot of what we're learning is a lot of the people who are getting these iPads who had less experience would just kind of freeze up on it. And then they'd feel a little embarrassed about not really knowing what to do with this thing. And if they had maybe an assistant super or like a project engineer they kind of trusted, they kind of go over them and kind of quietly ask them to help them set the thing up. Or in some cases, they just stick it in their desk and forget about it. Once we learned this, we set up that every time somebody got an iPad, they would mandatory have to go through an orientation. So to get the iPad, they'd have to come to the orientation, and then we would actually walk them through setting up their own iPad with them. And we tried to kind of create the entire thing in just a very judgment-free zone, make people feel good about it, show them how to do stuff. We then installed all the apps that we wanted them to have on it. We gave them handouts that showed them how to use the apps, once again, the simplest way possible. And the effect this had, particularly on more of our kind of our senior supers in the field, was huge. They were suddenly like, oh, wow, I can actually access every drawing on this. I don't have to carry the drawings, this giant set of drawings under my arm. They were super excited about it. And what it took was, once again, kind of building that sort of caring, learning community around them. So I think this is kind of the last thing I want to leave you with at the end of this presentation, is that whether it comes to scale or whether it comes to any project, it's really community building is kind of the most important thing. We'll go into Q&A. I want to mention one last thing as part of that kind of knowledge building effort. Me and a colleague of mine are trying to collect industry best practices. And also think about what an information schema for sort of collecting industry best practices would look like. So if you're interested in participating in a survey that's a short survey on industry best practices, please email me at preynoldson@entech.nyc. All right, that's it. Sorry, Andre, I think I went about 10 minutes longer than I planned to.
That's all right. I'm still trying to cope with the headache. And this was dense and smart and awesome. Somehow I'm saying this, I think every month. I know that we've got some top-notch speakers and we have really fascinating topics, and I trust that these people are awesome every damn month. And whenever we're reaching the end of it, I am still amazed and in awe and surprised. Thank you so much for this. I don't know, I found it absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
So let's go through this. So first question was me, actually. You had a slide in the beginning for LaGuardia about 14 projects, or something like that, 9 projects and 7 were VDC or something of the kind. Obviously, the phasing at LaGuardia must have been or must be a headache all on its own, right? When you have, you know, I don't know, a large portion of the airport still active and still operational, while you're carting in $4 billion of new buildings. How did you tackle the phasing of things, shutting down, opening up?
It's yeah, it was kind of it was a huge problem for us, the phasing. I think it's also kind of worth pointing out too. I mean, like everything was big on LaGuardia. Our master schedule that would go around, I think it was 50 pages long and had some 20,000 plus tasks on it. So even just trying to kind of like wrap your head around when things were going to happen meant like looking at this 50-page document, and you got a new one every month. The HOK, well, it was, I mean, this is kind of where I can't imagine doing this as anything other than a design build. I mean, HOK working with them, I should say not just HOK, but all the designers kind of working with the contractors were looking at the phasing. If I kind of go back, let me see if I can pull up an image. You can kind of take a little look at what was going on with the phasing here. Honestly, the most complicated part of the phasing wasn't even the buildings, was the roadway network. Because the roadway network also has to stay active. So you have to have this system of like temporary roads and everything going around it. You'll kind of notice what's happening here is like the green stuff on the top is actually the active airside where there's still parking planes. And they're basically, you know, the whole thing is this real kind of puzzle piece, because you can't, you know, you have to have the central heating and refrigeration plant built first, because that kind of powers all the other buildings. And then you can't actually finish the concourse until you at least have enough of a section, if you until you kind of build a bridge going through. So that if you kind of look at this, there's actually a little mini bridge right here that's connecting. So you're still coming in through the old terminal and then going through this little mini bridge. And then once you kind of get the next one active, you can demolish that piece. But then this is also being accessed through kind of a little temporary mini bridge as well. When we were doing this during the early planning, we actually did 2D sheets instead of 4D. I did a special phasing model in Revit, and then that became, we had, I think, 17 pages. And the funny thing about that phasing, the 17-page phasing sheets, is that we had a number of meetings where the first thing that would happen is just a 20-minute argument about what was actually day one. Where civil would be like, no, day one is this. That's when we're driving. That's when I'm demolishing this thing. And then building would be like, no, but that's not day one. Day one is when I demolish this this other thing. And it was really kind of interesting watching like all these groups come together. And once again, I can't stress this enough. Like you need visual aids to kind of understand these things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Gary is asking if Revit Server was considered in 2017, and if there was resistance from the Port Authority.
I don't remember a switch. So, I mean, I left Skanska in 2018. To my knowledge, we were still on the server setup at that point. So we didn't do Revit Server. We had a lot of conversations with Autodesk, and kind of what it came down to at the end of the day was that Autodesk was looking at the expense that they would have to incur in order to kind of basically create a duplicate of BIM 360 or Revit Server on this kind of like secured server setup, and that they would basically have to have an entire other team kind of like assigned to it and everything else. So it was kind of like, when we were kind of talking to them, it seemed very clear that it was just going to be a big, it was going to be a big lift for them. So I don't know. I do know that JFK uses BIM 360. I don't know off the top of my head what Newark uses, but I know with a lot of kind of pushing from us as well as from STV, we got the Port Authority to relax that cloud restriction a little bit.
Along with that, have you considered building a whole virtual desktop environment that everybody
for the automation?
For any portion or any combination of your team members?
We did. So we actually we had a physical computer that was our server. I mean, it was a physical computer, it wasn't even hooked up to a monitor. I don't remember. I do remember having the conversation about virtual work, a virtual workspace. I mean, every time we're having this conversation at EnTech right now as well. Every time I've had the conversation about virtual workspaces, for whatever reason, the economics of it never seems to work out, and people end up still using basically physical machines that you access remote.
Interesting. We just did a gig on that at AU for the A2K people, you know, our sponsors who provide virtual desktops. And I'm like, my company, for our particular case, it did make financial sense. I can see how and where it didn't or doesn't for others. I think some of the larger firms are building their own rather than going into a vendor like AWS or whoever else is out there. It's kind of interesting because I know that for this, where you want to or have to own your own servers and cannot just rent a cloud from Amazon or IBM. There's, I don't know, what was it? Alan Polinsky built a thing for 50 users for one of the co-located projects, I think Lincoln Center or something like that. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. Next question here. Bob Yori, did you find IFC sufficient to represent the model geometry?
So Calibri runs on IFC, and so we did find it sufficient. What we found was the problems though is that the IFC files are kind of big. At least the way, I mean, and I should say the way we were exporting IFCs, I'm trying to remember if we were using, I'm trying to remember because we used the specific kind of like Calibri schema for it. But we didn't really have a lot of problems. For me, IFC is like this thing that I just want it to be so much better, and it's just not as good as I want it to be. We definitely hit, the files were bigger and we had a lot of more trouble working with them. I mean, geometrically, it wasn't that big of a problem, but I think it was more of a kind of a file size issue for us. We were fine with the geometric representation. The other thing that had a lot of promise that Val was looking into, Val Spetkov, I mentioned earlier, was Smart BIM, which allowed you to actually manipulate IFC data. But we also, I mean, that also kind of had some challenges as well. I mean, once again, like for me, there's this idea that kind of IFC being open and I can directly manipulate model data like in the file rather than actually having to use a platform is like the dream, but it never seems to happen. Nobody seems to really get the IFC schema. The smart build, the building smart documentation on is really, it's hard for me to understand. So yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer to your question was the geometry was sufficient, but a lot of other things were insufficient.
Okay, what else? Oh, my pet peeve, quality control. You said the more, what was it? The more automation you do, the more important the human becomes. Something of the kind. How do you, and you said you learned it the hard way, right? Which is kind of what this group is about. Somebody learns it the hard way and then we all ride your coattails. What would you do better? How would you anticipate or plan, organize around that automation and then do your human QC overlay, whatever, so you don't show up Monday morning and a little mistake has occurred 500,000 times?
Yeah, absolutely.
How would you tackle it in the future, I guess?
I mean, I think back when we were doing this and we had like 3 different plugins, I mean, that's kind of a big problem with the industry, is that because all these, these are all like point solutions, not platform solutions, and also because most of the platform solutions don't even have the automations built into them that you want, you end up having to have like 5 different automation solutions. So that's kind of one thing that I think I would take another look at if I was doing this again today, is trying to find a way to have one type of automation solution instead of kind of like, well, sometimes I'm using Calibri, sometimes I'm using iConstruct, sometimes I'm using RTV tools, sometimes I'm using Python. That'd be one aspect of it, trying to kind of find more platform-like solutions. I mean, I know ImagineIt has a solution. Once again, we weren't able to use it at the time because of the cloud thing. But I know ImagineIt has like an automated solution that we probably would have looked more at. I know Microdesk has like a BIM-RX automation. BIM 360 has come a very long way. I'd probably look a lot harder at them now and maybe kind of doing some more stuff with Forge. The other thing is, I mean, Windows Task Scheduler, I don't know. I mean, I'd kind of, to me, Windows Task Scheduler was problematic because once again, every time the computer restarted, it seemed to restart our Windows Task Scheduler, or it would switch the task to off. And I spent hours on Stack Overflow trying to figure out how to make that not happen. And it just seemed to keep happening month after month. So there's an aspect of that. Like I'm a little leery about kind of just writing a script in Python and then having, like this kind of Goldbergian kind of like device where it's like you have a Python script that then like you write a batch that runs the Python script, and then Windows Task Scheduler has to run the batch. I'd probably avoid doing those kinds of solutions as well. The other thing, knowing what I know now, I'd probably approach some of the BIM execution plan standards differently. I mean, once you kind of, once you start kind of getting into coding or at least thinking about automation, it kind of rewires your brain to where you start thinking about if, like, is this file name searchable? Is this file name repeatable? Is this file name simple enough that I can kind of run this automation on it? So I think I would probably kind of revisit that as well, like looking at some of that work. I mean, we were starting to have those conversations back in 2014, but we were just starting to get into automation. I mean, I wasn't doing, between 2014 where I was doing almost no automation, and then 2016, 17, like 2016 where I'm actually writing stuff in Python, and Val's kind of like writing this like these auto scripts on the side, and John and Samia are writing like Dynamo scripts. Like it was kind of a big shift for us.
Okay. Robert Otani, going for the big prize. Post-construction, leveraging of all the models, data that you've created, 15,000 sheets of as-built. So what's post-construction? What's post-occupancy? Is there ideas of leveraging that?
Yeah, I think
on LaGuardia or anything else for that matter.
On how to leverage all that data we produced?
Yeah. So
I'll tell you what the Port Authority is planning to do with it, or at least what they were planning to do with it 2 years ago. And then I'll give you my thoughts. So they did have an asset data deliverable, and then they also had a concept of kind of having some sort of a back to that idea of unique keys, that they would have equipment codes put back into the files so that they would be able to leverage it at some point in the future. Also having a Navisworks Revit as-built. We had to deliver all of our as-built in Revit, well, except for the Civil 3D stuff. but we had to deliver all the trade files in like an LOD 500 Revit on format at the end. What else did we owe them? Yeah, so that was kind of, that was putting this stuff in place. I know that they're using Maximo. I know that Maximo still doesn't really play nice with Revit, though. I guess Autodesk announced something at the AU keynote. So I'm not 100% sure what the Port Authority, what the specifics are of their kind of their facilities management plan. For me, I think it's really tricky thinking about what you do with all this data. For my team, we put a lot of focus on the confluence in terms of making sure that we capture the lessons learned. That felt to us like the kind of the really powerful piece of it. So we wanted to make sure that whatever lessons we were learning on this, kind of like we could carry through into the future. I don't know, I'm kind of struggling with this. What do you do? I should have a better answer for what do you do with all this stuff at the end. I'll tell you, because I just, I've been in some other engagements with owners, and it's like Maximo doesn't have an integration. Tririga for space planning doesn't have an integration. There aren't really, like a lot of the digital twin stuff, not the concept of digital twin, but a lot of the digital twin platforms still feel like they're kind of like in beta testing. So it's like, I don't know what to do with all the, I don't know what to do with all the data. I do think there's probably an answer to it that's not model based. Frankly, I think the data is probably better outside the model. I'll never forget, I think his name, I think it was Stephen Wolf, who was the construction director for Target way back at like a BIM forum, like back in like 2010 or something, said that we're kind of like models are BIM is just kind of one more database for us. It's not the only database, it's just one more database. What we really want is all this kind of data. It was all about like, how can you guys give us structured data, and not data that's structured to be in BIM, but data that's structured that we can use. And the answer was not COVID. So I think there's a part of it for me that's like, how do you get all the junk out of a Revit model and just get the data that people need in a format they need?
I'm laughing because I totally agree. Like the information that most people, whether it's a facilities manager or an owner, is going to need is probably about half as much information as that you delivered.
Yeah.
And so how do you actually get that out? Because unless someone's updating those files every year, it's going to get lost in 2 years or 3. Yeah,
I mean, the solution that I'm kind of used to is sort of like the cryogenically freezing your head solution, which is like you just put everything in Navisworks, and then it's kind of like, well, hopefully, it's like if you had like a disease and you cryogenically freeze yourself and hope there's a cure for it in the future. Like, to me, that's kind of what like just giving people a Navisworks turnover model is. Because they're kind of too big for anybody to operate. It's unrealistic to expect like operation staff to, unless you're going to spend that money to actually train all your operation staff on like using something like Navisworks, they're never going to use it. So it's I don't know the answer. Rob, what was the name of the TT Core product that packages Dynamo scripts into plugins?
Oh, not Dino, it was Grasshopper.
Oh,
Grasshopper scripts. Yeah, that's Swarm.
Swarm, that was it. I was trying to remember that earlier.
I'm interested in your knowledge management thing too, which is an industry problem, right? It's not a, it's sort of harnessing all those lessons learned.
Yeah, I mean, we really liked Confluence. I don't know that, I also feel like there might be better, I think that definitely teams need wikis. I also don't want to say that wikis are the solution. I should say as well, I've been through a series of like failed blogs, like websites and things like this. I should say like internal kind of things to try to get this started. And Confluence was the most successful one that I had. And a big part of kind of getting it to work was the fact that we actually ran meetings from it so that people kept getting exposed to it over and over again. Because if you're kind of, you know, everybody wants to just take notes on like whatever their note app is or whatever Word doc they like. And so kind of trying to get people to give up that habit and move in, and move into the kind of this new platform is tricky. I don't know, today I might even just do it on Slack. We had a big conversation back then. I noticed kind of a generational divide of younger folks that really liked chat and wanted to have everything be chat. Like you didn't have notes, it would just all be chat. And then people like me who want a more structured format that kind of looks like a blog. I mean, I do know that Confluence also has like a hip chat plugin that was supposed to be some chat. We never kind of ended up experimenting with it, at least when I was there. But at the same time too, I mean, I kind of look at it, it's an industry-wide problem. The project engineers, I can't tell you how many times I've seen it where a decision is made that came down to just, you luckily happen to have that person in the meeting who wasn't looking at their phone that moment when the issue came up, and then mentioned a thing that they remember from 10 years ago.
Right.
All right, we have one from Eugene Orlik. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. So Eugene found a lot of similar issues when managing file repositories. He found some workable solutions. The biggest issue was pushback from IT and document control. What's your take on that?
That was because he was trying to do an automation?
I don't know.
No.
Eugene, do you want to?
Well, yes, actually automation trying to manage different projects, and like with Box, you cannot store files on a server. With other platforms you can, and trying to get all this data somewhere in different folders. And not necessarily in the same folders that the GC would have them split up, and having our own kind of structure.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you about IT struggles. I mean, I've excuse me, I've dealt with kind of every version. I mean, obviously, I think as soon as you like open up you know, like as soon as you start mentioning code to IT, they'll probably get a little nervous. I mean, that's kind of what I'm used to. The funny thing at Skanska was, I remember kind of like IT, like when I told IT that I was like kind of starting to do like Python and do these like batch scripts and stuff like that, they got really excited because they wanted to talk to me about it. And I was very surprised. I thought, like, you know, because I could wreck this computer, but like there are lines of code that will just like delete your whole drive or something like this. So I get IT getting uncomfortable. I don't really know. It's kind of a culture thing. I mean, you know, my current kind of IT situations, I can't even really run installs myself, for fear that I'll like end up kind of deleting a server. And I completely understand both ends of it, the kind of Wild West version and the other version. I think one way around it might be, I mean, if you're using Box like backs itself up. I don't know anything about like Box automations, but also then if it kind of takes it off of your server, they might get more comfortable with it.
Yeah, that's very similar experience. Basically, they get very nervous about third-party software being installed, and I'm for much better integration between VDC team and IT.
Yeah, it's always an ongoing struggle. I don't know what the tension is between kind of VDC and IT. I've definitely noticed it at some version of it, kind of at various places. I mean, I should say I get along very well with my current IT director. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just because, I mean, VDC wants to, my experience with it is VDC just wants to kind of experiment. They want to try stuff, and then kind of, you know, and they don't want to have to jump through a bunch of hoops to do it. But yeah, I think it's, I don't know, maybe there's a way to bribe your IT guy. Maybe find out what kind of what scotch he likes or something.
Now they're too afraid of the corporate
Oh no, I see.
of the corporate ATs. So
Yeah.
they're like,
Maybe
we're
ask them for a sandbox. That might be a way to go. Like just be like, hey, just give me this one directory that I can, I can play around in, and let me just make a proof of concept.
Yeah, their problem is third-party software managing your data, project data, basically.
Oh yeah, I could see that. I mean, honestly, this is a conversation I've had with a number of colleagues of mine in architecture in particular. A lot of the third-party plugins, particularly those that are kind of like content management. Greg Schleusner of HOK told me one time that that most content manager Revit plugins they literally can't use because of the confidentiality agreements that they have with clients. So like, he'll get propositioned all the time by people saying like, oh, I want you to try my, like my plugin or something, or like, I don't know. I don't know that ASSA Abloy's door plugin does this, but let's say they'll be like, hey, check this out. You got all the detailed doors from us. And then when you go and look at the fine print of it, they're like pulling all this data out of the project, which might not be a problem for the architect, but probably runs afoul of some kind of confidentiality with the owner. So I could see that as well. I think it's kind of it's a tricky thing because especially more like kind of newer startups are trying to build like a user database. Like that's like they're trying to kind of like build that up as kind of an asset, and so they get very aggressive about the data stuff, about the data collection.
All right. Shabit is talking about Ignite for their aviation projects. This is getting real detailed here. This is usually the moment where I'm saying, hey, look, guys, let's take this into the bar. We're getting too nerdy for the, like we've been at it for 2 hours and we're getting very nerdy and very detailed. And usually there's a group of like, a half a dozen or 10 people who want to go deeper, and we do that over a burger and a beer. But we're approaching 8 o'clock here. I don't want to hold up Piers any longer. He's got a 6-year-old daughter to attend to. Thank you so much, Piers. I can't express enough how amazing this was, and we're getting all kinds of good feedback here.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
Yep. So that's that for this year. Stay posted. I was just talking to Robert Yori here. We're currently thinking about bringing Marcelo on for next year, probably February, to talk a little bit about Dynamo. So stay posted. Stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on our meetup website with what's going on early next year. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening. Thank you, Piers.
Happy holidays. See you next year.
Everyone.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. Take care.